Thank you very much for Hongfei's kind introduction, and also, of course, thanks to the center for bringing me here to share with you my research and also my thoughts on how we could use digital tools for studying Chinese history. And I'd love to know more about your expertise and interests, but let me sort of run through what I've prepared, and we could have Q&A and discussion afterwards. So basically, what I'm trying to do in the coming 45 minutes or so will be presenting to you four sort of lens. And each of these lens would be a way of thinking about data, about pre-modern Chinese history especially. And what I'm trying to argue here is that each of these perspectives and each of these lenses bring with them its own methodological stakes. And I'll talk about those briefly here, and also, of course, invite your thoughts and suggestions and comments and feedback. So, first of all, a little bit about DH. That will be how I'll be calling digital humanities, just for the sake of brevity. Of course, obviously, like TCD is a center in the field of DH. So I'm not sure if I should be introducing really the paradigm of DH or not here, but just to be very brief, I take DH as a way of asking, redefining, and answering questions with a more intelligent set of tools. So this definition that I put up here is from a collection that have been trying to define the digital humanities paradigm. And of course, while reading it, you probably think, wow, that's just so broad, right, and vague, and what does it even mean? What I wanted to stress here is, by a more intelligent set of tools, I do not only refer to computational digital tools, but I'm trying to say that the conceptual tools, the sorts of questions that we are asking, the ways that we frame are ways of analyzing historical phenomena are also changed when the humanities meet the digital. And of course, that serves as somewhat the backdrop of the sorts of things that I'm going to introduce to you, which of course is mainly focused on Chinese history. And with that sort of theoretical paradigm in mind, the framework or the paradigm, of course, is also by no means entirely new. It has been introduced to the Chinese-speaking world as early as in the late 2000s. So I have done a little bit of research on tracing the trajectory. The paradigm of digital humanities began gaining traction, and there had been scholars debating and discussing and defining the digital humanities in the Chinese-speaking world as early as in 2009. And of course, even the ways of translating the term itself varies in different parts of the Chinese-speaking world. Well, firstly, in Taiwan, mainly it hinges upon how you phrase the digital, right? So 数位 or 数字 or 数码 in Taiwan and the mainland and Hong Kong, respectively. And of course, this is not just on the surface. The projects and the sorts of data sets that scholars and institutions have been working on also varies quite a bit. Some scholars also call this mode of inquiry digital history, especially when it comes to historical research, learning about history. And what we see in Chinese academia, especially from the 2010s, is that the three main sort of research processes, the usual sort of procedures in how we do research on history are all impacted by digital media and digitization. And these three processes are first the gathering, the collecting of the sources. And in the digital sort of era, this of course would involve gathering digital data, digitized texts, digitized electronic books, so on and so forth. And of course, then the going through of the material, the reading, the analysis. This now involves the computational analysis as well as the so-called traditional ways. And also the final, the end product, the results, right? The presentation of the outcomes, the writing up of papers and books now is also influenced by digitization and digital media. The outcomes are now also not just in, scholarly papers and books, not just print, right? But also the presentation, the publication of data sets, databases, interactive websites, what have you. So this is sort of the scene that we're looking at, especially from the 2010s onwards for historical research on China. And this was building on a lot of this sort of work. So the text processing and the construction of text databases based on sources for Chinese history. This has been ongoing for a long time, really. It could be traced back at least to the 1970s of corpus linguistics projects, the construction of large scales of historical sources from the 1980s, such as of the Siku Quanshu and the 25 dynastic histories, so on and so forth. And still, it's a very sort of popular tool, sort of a go-to tool for historians of China. This, of course, involves a lot of OCRing, right? Optical character recognition, or, basically the turning of books into digitized texts. Of course, nowadays, even our phones, have pretty good OCR functionality. But this took quite a lot of improving, right, and fine-tuning and adjusting the algorithms, especially for languages like Chinese, and especially for classical Chinese source texts. I know the center is a great meeting place for lots of experts in linguistics. So I guess I don't have to say much about this part where I really try to underline the challenges that the people who build databases face when they try to process classical Chinese texts. So first of all, no word boundaries, right, in classical Chinese. And even when these database companies or university research groups, when they try to process books that are print, meaning that they have sort of more unified typography, still it involves thousands of characters, several tens of thousands of Chinese characters, which of course is no easy feat for OCRing, meaning that it's quite hard to achieve a satisfactory accuracy rate for the OCR. There's bound to be errors, there's bound to be inaccuracies. Not to mention, of course, since there are no word boundaries, these texts are unpunctuated. The punctuating is part of the reading, right? Traditionally, it's part of the comprehending. It's part of the understanding of the text. It's done when the text is read. So that also means a lot of processing is needed, which is really the background that we're looking at, right? That is sort of the linguistic features, the characteristics about the data, the source text that we have, and that's sort of the backdrop of what we're going to discuss here. We also know it's a large body of material, especially for biographies. This, of course, I think 2 million biographies is a pretty sort of gross underestimation. It's hard to say, really, how many biographies there are. The Chinese History and Manual, Wilkinson, an earlier version of Wilkinson's manual estimated that there are 0.5 million. And of course, even with the database that I'm going to mention in a while, it has exceeded that number. So knowing that there is this huge wealth of material, lots of sources, lots of biographies, what do we do, right? With digitization technologies, with better OCR algorithms, with now machine learning even, right? There are ways that we can organize this sort of data and come up with new ways to analyze it. So this is the database that I've worked for when I was doing a postdoc. I was with them for 3 to 4 years, and this is a database run by Harvard, Peking University, and Academia Sinica since 2005. So it's a long sort of standing digital humanities project in Chinese studies. We've just celebrated the 20th anniversary in Beijing, just in June. And as you could imagine, back in 2005, there was no machine learning, there was no sort of, it's manual input, okay? And now that it's run for more than 20 years, it actually could be traced to a small data set collected by a sinologist from the 1980s and formally launched in 2005 when the data set was bequeathed to Harvard. Now it contains over 0.64 million historical figures, mainly from the Tang to the Qing dynasties. So this database focus mainly on pre-modern China. And of course, it's still ongoing. It's still, expanding. And so just to give you a quick idea of how the digitization is being done, especially when I was with them, when I was working with them. This was the semi-automation period I would sometimes describe as. We would pretty cruelly cut up a lot of the books that we have to process into split pages, and we were using the fast-speed scanners in the Harvard Law School and produce scanned images of the pages and run OCR on them, of course. So just one example would be the prefectural governors. So these, as you can see, would be modern editions of collections of biographies of the Tang, Cishi, So prefectural governors from Tang China. These would be the biographies that have been vetted and collated and studied by modern historians. And we have these high-resolution scans. Then we use OCR on them, and we try to code which part of the text correspond to which type of information that we are trying to extract and mine in the text. So, for example, people called Li Hui and Li Bi and Li Zhe from certain years, coming from each certain prefectures and acting as what sort of official in the bureaucracy. So from this you have a sense this is semi-automated. We are targeting collections of biographical material. We are looking at structured data. Especially back then. This was mid-2010s. And of course, a lot of painful and meticulous proofreading was involved. Because for those of you who have better eyesight, you can probably already identify some errors in the OCR output, such as Li Peng, right? So that character is erroneous, and Jue, Xue Jue, that is right. That's not the right thing, right? And already, you already have to sort of spot those two errors, and that also involved a lot of human input in the proofreading process and coding the data and so on, of course. So this is to give you a rough idea of what the database have been trying to do and what it has achieved, what sort of data that it has achieved, and what it enabled is the next part of my talk, which really centers on 4 perspectives, as I say. Each perspective here, I'll give you some examples, and I'll walk through and think with you together how they shape our understanding about Imperial China, and how, what are the implications of that way of thinking about Imperial China, especially the methodological stakes. We're talking about certain types of data and certain types of ways of presenting them and analyzing them, and of course that helps us arrive at certain types of observations on historical questions involved. So in this order, really. So first of all, geospatial analysis. So this is relevant to one of the sister projects of the China Biographical Database, and which is the CHGIS. I don't know if you are aware of this event or not, but actually tomorrow I'll be doing a workshop on some of these tools. So tomorrow at 2 p.m., right? And it's also a center event in collaboration with the Digital Humanities Center here. So I'll elaborate on some of these, the usage of these tools, but just to give you the gist here, CHGIS is a database with geographical information, systems data about Chinese history. And it's free and online and accessible. So place names and coordinates and historical geography of Chinese history, basically. And there's also search function and API functions and so on. So with this sort of data and combining with the information about people, imagine the kinds of things, the kinds of questions historians could be asking. So for instance, comparing the distribution of registered household population over 1,000 years, over a millennium, right? That's like a grand, big history sort of research question, which of course could be asked, but could not be easily visualized or answered, right? Especially not in a data-driven, a solid way, right? There could be impressionistic guesses. There could be examples that could be enlisted by historians that could be explained, that explain some of the trends, but it's only with this sort of large-scale data gathering and analysis that we could be looking at these questions more concretely. And of course, when I say concretely, it's not really the final word, right? There could be new sorts of questions that could be raised and sort of subsets of questions that have to be solved. Just hearkening back to sort of my initial definition about the digital humanities and so on. So just to give you like some visualizations, right? Geographical visualizations of this, right? Of the registered household over 1,000 years, right? So snapshots. So this is the Hanshu. So in 2 CE, from the official history of the former Han dynasty. So the blue dots represent the registered household locations. Okay, so basically, you could see these as where the Han Dynasty had established administrative control, where they could be trying to tax the people, right? Where they gather information about the households. And if you jump 1,000 years ahead to the Song, to 1102. This is from the Songshi, from the official Song dynastic history, and the light blue dots are from then, of the same information of the registered households. So comparing the two already gives us some sorts of clues that you could look further at, right? Where would be the regions where the imperial regime had retreated? What regions it consolidated its power to hold a census and a survey of the land and the families and so on, right? So for instance of northwestern China, right, of course were controlled by regimes such as the Tanguts and so on. So no longer part of the Han areas under the Song. But of course in the southern regions, in the Lianghu, right, Hubei and Hunan and the Lingnan regions and the Fujian region, you see a substantial strengthening of the power to do surveys, to tax the settled population and so on. Also the development of the southern China. We see large sort of leaps in that sort of respect when compared to the Han, where you see much more scattered, right, centers of power. Another sort of classic problem in my field of middle period China would be the role of the civil service examinations. So what sort of social function did it perform? How much social mobility did it enable? Back in the mid-20th century or so, social historians have used registers of 进士, of these presented scholars, of basically the the highest level of the civil service exam sort of takers to gauge how the civil service examination system enabled them to rise in society. For instance, if maybe their fathers and grandfathers weren't officials, but they themselves had entered the officialdom through these civil service examinations and even rose to sort of the top rank in the bureaucracy, then of course we know these would be the group that were socially upward. This sort of question in some studies make use of the registers of these scholars, these lists of scholars and their geographical distribution from 2 years, 2 lists of civil service exams. But of course, now we could be much more comprehensive, right? We could look at the whole Tang, well, from the 7th century to the 10th century, and also compare it with the Northern Song, when really the civil service examination system gained much more prominence. And we see, of course, a pretty drastic development. The dots in yellow would be those powerful families. They're basically controlling the imperial bureaucracy. These would be the dominant elite families. And on to the Northern Song, when those in pink geographically were much more sort of widely distributed all over China proper, and especially in the coastal areas and in Sichuan and so on. And those, of course, point to us the possible areas that we could zoom in on, right? We could look at why these areas had regional sort of centers of families who did well in the civil service exams and so on and so forth. So this 2 sets of examples really is just to give you a taste of what I'm trying to argue here is that using historical GIS and using geospatial analysis on this sort of data helps us, of course, map out the historical information, especially with distribution of people and so on. It helps us visualize. But there also poses some demands on graphic skills. Sometimes you could school things by merely changing the color or changing the sort of the way you present how it's represented on a map. And of course, this sort of geospatial analysis is good for the focus on regional and local perspectives. Because the maps that I've shown you are not static, right? They're static on my slide, but of course in this kinds of software, like the GIS software, ArcGIS, MapInfo, QGIS, and so on, you can zoom in on any part of the map and have more fine-grained visualization and analysis. So, which of course would be great for regional and local perspectives. That also involves integrating diverse data sources, which comes with its pros and cons. And I'll come back to this point a little bit later. So quickly moving on to social networks analysis, SNA. Quite different from what we just mentioned, but in the China Biographical Database, also very relevant to how we populate the database with various types of information. So for instance, the powerful families that I just mentioned under the Tang, the aristocratic families, a lot of them had intermarriages. And in their tombs, they write epitaphs, stone epitaphs about the people, about members of their families. A lot of this information is collected by scholars and collated, and they serve as an invaluable resource for studying who those people actually were, how they related to each other. And so one systematic way of studying them would be to mine and to extract the relationships in them, especially about kinship, how they married with one another. So this was done in the database, especially through manual and semi-automated tagging. So the kinds of boxes you are seeing, the blue boxes are the bureaucratic titles. So these are automatically matched and tagged on the system called Marcus, which is run by a ERC project under Hilde de Weert, now at Leuven. And those in red, the red boxes are the people that are mentioned, okay? And once you systematically mine this sort of data, you could draw a network of people. So, and that was what a lot of digital humanists do, right? They look at networks, they look at patterns of networks, and so on. And as for the epitaphs, the kinship relations in epitaphs, it's this sort of pattern. This was about 1,000 epitaphs from Tang, China. And of course, this sort of pattern, we could further ask questions, right? What are those clusters? How big those clusters are, right? And these are really quite focused, right? These are big clusters. These refer to concentration of elite power in a handful of intermarriages and so on. And with this, of course, historians could raise further questions about, how is the structure of each marriage network, who they involve, and how they are formed, and how they collapse, and so on and so forth, especially leading up to the collapse of the medieval aristocracy, and so on. A lot of these SNA, social network analysis, is done with software such as Pajak and Gephi, coupled with channel biographical database data. Social network analysis is also good with analysis of correspondence networks. When people write each other, there is a clear sender and receiver, right? So there is a clear corresponding network there. A letter sent from A to B. This is actually the sort of thing that I study for my PhD. My PhD was on the letter writing culture of the Song elites. And a lot of those letters were about ideas, right? They were intellectual exchanges between Confucian thinkers and so on. And visualizing these networks also help you reorient some of the people that those thinkers were actually interacting with. So, for instance, Zhu Xi, of course, perhaps arguably the most important Neo-Confucian thinker of Song China. You see the sorts of thinkers that he was interacting most with. So from these sorts of networks, you already see each line represents letter exchanges, and each dot is one person, right? So there are the interrelationships that Zhu Xi was building is quite conveniently visualized. And of course, one might say, what do we learn actually, right? It's all a blur, right? There's so much. You don't know where to look at. With these sorts of software, it's nice that you could reorient and you could focus. You could ask what you're actually trying to sort of look at. So let's say if you are interested in Juicy, you could also make his data the center, right? And we are talking about these ego networks, right? With one person at the center and looking at what sorts of relationships he was having with and how many letters he was exchanging. So also the dots for this I set as corresponding to the number of letters. So the larger the dot, the more letters that he was sending back and forth with. And of course you see, Lü Zuqian and Lu Jiuyuan and Zhang Shi, Chen Fuliang, these people being the more important in his network. And of course sometimes prompting more reading, right? You would be curious why these people and what they were discussing and so on and so forth. So the China Biographical Database includes that sort of social associations data, the exchanges between people. Of course, by no means easy to gather systematically, but we see those as pretty important for understanding the social aspect of Chinese figures. Seeing through this lens, of course, is discovering the interconnectedness of human society. This is, attracting more and more attention, especially with the science on complex networks, right? Not just on pre-modern societies and histories, but on many of the things that basically any sort of phenomenon could be seen as a network under network science. I would also argue that, especially for our cases under concern for Imperial Chinese history, sometimes the integration of synchronous and dynamic processes is rather difficult. This is more of a data question rather than a methodological one. So there is not enough high quality data that is gathered on the relationships of people to present them as a dynamic and sort of synchronous analysis. And of course, that means more work could be done, more sort of gathering and analysis of this data on social interactions could be done. The third being prosopographical and statistical analysis. This is straightforward and so rather easy to understand. For those friends here who are less familiar with prosopography, you could understand it as a sort of collective biography. So looking at a group of people at their common features and starting from the concrete data, using a sort of inductive method, looking at sort of the characteristics of a group. So just to talk about a quick example about the whole sort of span of things in the database here. And on a very sort of simple issue, how was the average age? What was the average age or life expectancy, right, of the people in the biographical database? So for the data with the years, with data on years, on the age, of course that means the year of birth and death. The average age of death is 61. Of course, you could then establish that those with records that the biographical project has mined are actually from pretty elite backgrounds, right? Because it's by no means a sort of, this is pretty good life expectancy, right? Especially for we're talking about Tang to Qing dynasties. But let's sort of reframe the question a little bit. If this is for the whole span, right, and for everyone with this sort of data, so it's for both men and women that have been accounted for in the database. How about for the females? We see a very different distribution, right? The distribution of the death ages, right? Compare again, both male and female, right? And just female. What explains the sort of double hump in the high occurrence of death in 20-something, 50-something? Yeah.
Childbirth?
Yes, of course, naturally, right? Naturally, right? So especially before basically the 19th century, this was quite normal, right? Because of death due to childbirth. But this is quite hard to really study without data. It's easy to make impressionistic guesses and overall observations as historians have done and give some examples, but this is more systematic and comprehensive. So this sort of lens is good for identifying commonalities of a group, especially of a group of many, many people, right? We're talking about hundreds and thousands. Not easy to sort of conceptualize. These are groups larger than our usual frames of reference. It involves piecing individual biographies together at scale. And of course, prosopography is about looking at some common features, certain things that historians are interested in, age and class and sort of social groups and so on. But one of the problems is the criteria for the information that we are gathering could sometimes be restrictive. Sometimes it's just limited to the things that you think are interested and you think are worth gathering for. And finally, textual markup and analysis. So the platform that I mentioned just now, Marcus, is for classical Chinese and also Korean. It's a automated markup platform. And it also involves functionality, integrating with CBDB data. So you could feed any text, you could upload any text and tag it. Tag it with matched CBDB and CHGIS data entries. In other words, tagging the names and the dates and the place names in a text. And I'll say some more about the platform tomorrow at the workshop. So these boxes are tagged and marked automatically. It tries to look for people's names and place names and official titles, and gives you maps and also entries about the people and so on. And of course, you could tweak it, right? It's not that, oh, this is the end product. It is something you could read with. You could tag things that you observe, you identify, that is not in the data, right? And also export the marked up text as HTML or XML format or TXT formats and so on. It also has integration with text repositories such as the Chinese text project, cText. So there is interoperability between these systems. This, of course, builds on a long history of digitizing historical sources, text for Chinese history, including primarily the 25 standard histories done at Academia Sinica. This dates back to the 1980s, 1984, I think. And of course, back then, it involves lots of scholars typing up and collating and proofreading these classical Chinese texts. And also this CityU project involving, of course, a large, huge corpora of the Imperial Library, 3,400 books, over 800 million characters. So seeing through this lens, text, markup, and analysis, finally. Of course, it's a more streamlined, it's more shareable way of reading these sources. It's also a way of taking notes even. You could indicate which part of the text is a person, or is a place name, or is whatever. These texts could be defined by any user. This means it could be a new reading sort of practice for historians, which goes hand in hand with how historians or humanists have traditionally read their sources. It doesn't have to replace it, right? But it goes hand in hand. And also it is a good way to go beyond just simple keyword searches when gathering data. It is also the establishing of platforms. We see several platforms in the Chinese studies scene that have been set up for this sort of text markup and tagging. Not just markers, but with several major DH projects in China and in Taiwan, such as DocuSky and so on. So again, these four sort of perspectives, as I would argue, each of them bring with their own methodological stakes. Each has a certain view of the data, right? And of course, each could be limiting, but now what we could do is, of course, combine and think about how these perspectives, each one of them, help us cast light on our research questions about China. We don't have to restrict ourselves to just one. And of course, digital humanists usually argue that this sort of digitization and digital analysis helps scaling up our study of these phenomena. This is especially considering the material and the data now is readily available. The resources that I've mentioned are open, they're accessible, and there are increasingly large amounts of data sets out there. Also, the learning of DH tools have become easier. There are so many MOOCs, online courses, online tutorials about digital humanities tools, including for the Chinese studies field. And this is really becoming one of the main modes of inquiry for the Chinese history field as well. It's transforming how historians of China are being trained and how they work. And hopefully, like I have noted here, they do provide important possibilities to help us redefine our questions and also reframe how we answer them. And last but not least, some of the things that I've mentioned I've written in papers, and I've tried to bring them together under sort of a thread. And I'm happy to share the papers about the basic definitions of DH for the China field and the history of the DH field, especially its prehistory, as I would call it, and how the paradigm is currently going mainstream in the field, especially since the mid-2010s, and how infrastructure building is transforming how China historians work, as well as teaching learning side of things for the field. And I'll be happy to share or email any of these to you. But I've taken already a lot of time, and let's hear your questions and comments. Thank you.